This is the 5 tech things you should know about, episode number 94, and it's brought to you by Audible. Go over to audiblepodcast.com/geekazine for a 14-day free trial. The big news is Steve Jobs has decided to step down, become the chairman of the board. We honor his tradition and his memory of being CEO in this episode, the special edition of the 5 tech things you should know about. 5 tech things that Steve Jobs has done. It starts now. Welcome to the 5 tech things you should know about for you weekend warriors in tech that don't want too much information overload. Let's get into the 5 tech things that you should know about. Before I get into the 5 tech things, I just want to explain this a little bit. I know a lot of you are wondering, well, he's not dead yet. He's just stepping down, and it's all okay. Why are we doing like a eulogy type situation? Well, the man-shaped technology from when I was a little kid to now. And if it wasn't for a person like Steve Jobs, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing right now. In the last 10 years alone, Steve Jobs has reinvented the computer market as best that he could. So this little bit to honor Steve Jobs, I'd like to do it, and maybe he gets a chance to actually see it and see all the good he does. He is having problems right now, so if this helps him lift his spirits a little bit, then I'm all for it. So that's why I'm doing this special edition. Not for Steve Jobs to see it, because the chances of him actually watching this video, not that great. But at least I know I tried. Let's get into the 5 tech things you should know about. We're going to start in the first thing that Steve Jobs did, and that was back in the 70s when they created the Apple I. The Apple I wasn't the prettiest thing on the world. It was made out of wood, and it was made out of circuits. It was made in their garage. And it was made by Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. Well, see, the thing about Steve Wozniak is at that time, Steve Wozniak was working at HP Computers. And they had first refusal right to anything that Steve Wozniak did. So they said, okay, well, we'll take the Apple computer and we'll take it to HP and we'll let them, give them the chance to refuse. And they did. And they were surprised because they kind of wanted funding from HP. That's a great way to start. So they said, okay, well, we'll take this to a new thing that's happening called the Homebrew Computer Club, and we'll show off this Apple, and we'll see if there's any interest from it, and go from there. Now, with Apple, they got it all set up. There was actually 3 people, and he wrote the actual booklet on Apple, and then kind of said, no, this isn't going to go anywhere, and left, which is kind of sad because, Apple's such a multi-billion-dollar company today. But this is the first Apple, and this is the first thing that Steve Jobs did to change technology.
Today we celebrate the first glorious anniversary of the Information Purification Directives. You created for the first time in all history a garden of pure ideology.
The second part is we jump up to 1984. Apple went through its run and went to Apple II, Apple IIe. I know I had friends that had the slimline Apple II. It was like the little laptop that in the 70s was the size of a laptop. But anyway, the whole point is it was time for a change. And I remember this commercial well. It was 1984 was the Super Bowl. Now, some of you had the opportunity to actually see this commercial before the Super Bowl. A month before it ran on the Super Bowl Sunday, it actually ran in some theaters. And in a couple TV markets, towards the end of the day, you got to see this commercial. So if you were really, really lucky and stayed up like at 2 o'clock in the morning, you got to see this commercial. But this is what changed everything in 1984. I know we started out with a whole bunch of Ataris in our computer classroom, and all of a sudden they switched over to Macs within the summer. It was the greatest thing in the world to play on a Mac, be able to do a whole bunch of stuff. This is where I got my start doing video editing. I was working on a Macintosh, and people would stand in front of the camera, and then I'd hit a button, and it would slowly scan their picture, and therefore you would actually get a picture of them. I used to make movie posters out of the pictures. Some of the pictures, if they moved a little bit too early, then it would look really weird, and I'd have a little bit of fun with it in my movie posters. But I did a lot of cool editing around that time. But this commercial was the most influential Super Bowl ad, and of course started Super Bowl advertising for the Super Bowl. And that's another thing that Steve Jobs did. And it's great. But of course, he had the Macintosh, which was also the revolutionary change in computers in 1984. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. In 1984, the Super Bowl commercial was a new awakening to Apple. But on the other end, there were a little bit of power struggles going on. In fact, by 1985, Steve Jobs had figured, well, we need to do something about this. So he hired on John Sculley. And John Sculley was going to be the mentor and kind of carry on tradition if need be. But then they got into some more clashes, and then by May of 1985, John Sculley convinced the board of directors that Steve Jobs was not doing his job, and so he left. And then they said, okay, Steve Jobs, you're done, you're fired, time to move on. And Steve Jobs was taken back. In fact, if you listen to his speech, Stanford speech from 2005, he talked about how he felt down in the dumps. He wanted to leave Silicon Valley. He wanted to be done with this thing, but he didn't. And he decided to move along forward. And with the help of a man by the name of Ross Perot, a guy that ran for president about 10, 12 years ago, all of a sudden he had funding to create a new computer company, and he did so. And he created the NeXT computer company. And this is the next stage here. Created this software and this hardware. By 2000, the first NeXT computer came out. By 2001, NeXT computers were really starting to take shape. You had the NeXT Cube, you had the NeXT server, you had the NeXT stations, and then you had the NeXT software. Now, you might think that you've never used the NeXT software, but in all reality, if you have a Mac and it's running OS 10, yes, you have run the NeXT software, because that's what it turned into, was this software right here. So what happens? Well, Apple in 1996 wants Steve Jobs back. After they have all this back and forth, and they changed from Sculley to Amelio it was just too much. So they said, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to get Steve Jobs back however we can get him back. And they got him back, and they got NeXT back with it by purchasing NeXT and then saying, okay, Steve Jobs, you're now CEO. And the best part about that is, like I said, NeXT becomes Mac OS, and the rest is history. And that's the number 3 part of Steve Jobs. Of course, from 1996, Steve Jobs had been really trying to figure out, well, what are we going to do with Apple? How are we going to compete with Microsoft, who just put out Windows 95, who just put out Windows NT, who has the corporate America pretty much tied in their little hands? And that's basically what Microsoft did. So Steve Jobs said, well, we got to gear to a new hipper, newer community. So by 2000, all of a sudden, this new program comes out called iTunes. And with iTunes, you got the Mac OS 10, and everybody in Windows land is going, I want iTunes. I remember the day that iTunes became available on Windows PCs, and everybody downloaded. It was wild. But then the iPod came out, and it changed the way we listen to music forever. And that's well and good in its own right, but this trumps it. And this was happening in January of 2007. Steve Jobs stood on stage and made one of his best speeches ever, and showed off the first Apple smartphone in the iPhone. And it changed the way that we thought about phones. Now, there were smartphones before, but those smartphones had styluses, and they were really hard to navigate through the screens and stuff like that. It was great software. It was just the technology wasn't there, and worked and didn't work. I know I had my smartphone. I had an 8125, and I loved it. But the second I got my iPhone, that was night and day. And that's what happened. In June of 2007, the first iPhone came out, and everybody was just completely enamored. The only problem was it was on AT&T's network, which everybody just didn't like. But it was still on AT&T network. And then in 2008, June, the iPhone 3G came out, still on AT&T network. There were 3G problems, which turned out to be software solutions. And once that happened, everybody was happy. And then the 3GS came out in 2009. And everybody was happier because it was faster processor, and it could do on AT&T's network, which upgraded at that point to 7 megabyte transfer rate. When the iPhone 4 came out, there, of course, they had more power, but they were still set on AT&T's limits. And then, of course, Verizon came in, and they said, okay, we're going to put it on Verizon's network. Hasn't really worked. Now with iPhone, at first it was kind of a little bit weary, but now it's kind of settled down. People are happy with the Verizon or content for that matter. But now the iPhone 5 is coming out, and there's a possibility that it's going to be on all 4 networks. And if that happens, we're going to see a very big switch to iPhones. A lot of these people that didn't want to go to AT&T now will be able to go to Sprint. Now will be able to go to T-Mobile. And of course, that'll create a new buzz. So the iPhone is the second pick on the top 5 here. And it's an amazing, amazing device. I know I've used it hundreds of times, and I can't speak any more highly of the device. It's great. You know, I'm not a big reader. In fact, I get books and then I get through like a chapter or two and then I kind of put it down because for me, print is dead. But with Audible.com, I can actually get the audio version of that book as long as it's on the same revision. And I listen to that audiobook while I read it. And the best part about it is I keep my attention a little bit more because I have 2 senses going at the same time. And I get through books a lot better and a lot faster. Now, sometimes I don't want to read the book. I just want to sit on the plane or in the car and listen to the audiobooks and go from there. And I get to do that too. It's a great program, and I've used it many times. And get yourself these audiobooks because once you download them, they're yours to keep, even if you decide not to continue on with Audible's service. It's a 14-day free trial, and you get a free download with that too. And all you have to do is go over to audiblepodcast.com/geekazine. audiblepodcast.com/geekazine. Get you a 14-day gold membership and 1 free download from audible.com. You continue to get it, you'll get free audio downloads as you go, and you'll get to see what I see with audible.com. So go over to audiblepodcast.com/geekazine and happy reading with audible.com. This is the one thing that really shapes Steve Jobs. Now I'm going to paint a picture for you, and it might be a little bit hard to remember, but this was about 2 years ago. Rumors started coming out that Steve Jobs, of course, he was just going through his hiatus before with his liver transplant and everything. And he was working on a project, and this project was a tablet, and the rumor mill started up like no tomorrow. And the one thing that people would say, and I was one of them, there wasn't going to be a tablet come out by 2010. Just not going to happen. Well, in January of 2010, we were all proven wrong. As Steve Jobs stood on stage, all the rumors were pretty much debunked as he talked, and he showed off the first iPad, the first usable tablet in our community. And now we've had tablets in the past, and they've been different types of configurations. They've been laptops. You flip the screen around, you close it, and it's a tablet. There have actually been tablets using stylus touch screens. In fact, we saw a video from 1994 on how they envisioned what a tablet should be like. So there's always been an idea for a tablet, but it was Steve Jobs that made the tablet happen. And at that point, once Steve Jobs says, I'm doing it, all these other companies will realize we are so behind the 8 ball on this one. The tablet is something that Steve Jobs brought to fruition. Not Bill Gates, not Eric Schmidt, not anybody else, not Michael Dell, not anybody else. Steve Jobs can say he is the founding father of tablet computing. And at that point, we were going for netbooks. And now all of a sudden, this tablet comes along, no keyboards to worry about. You just basically turn it on and go. It's not a great processor, but it gets the job done. It shows your pictures. You type your documents. You can send them off on Wi-Fi or get the 3G. When the iPad 2 came out with the dual-core processor, it just enhanced everything. And now with the iPad 3 rumored to be coming out very, very soon, which they kind of squelched that rumor and said it's not going to come out until January. The new iPad 3 will have even better functionality and usage, to the point where you have to replace your laptop. I don't know. I have a pretty beefy laptop. That's why I have this MacBook Pro. But it's interesting to think on how we changed. overnight to a tablet system, and it was all because of Steve Jobs here. So that's why it takes the number one spot, because not too many people can say that they've changed a form of technology overnight.
Pick it up on your stereo. And if you want to ride, then here we go. This is Joy Time Radio. Joy Time Radio. You can pick it up on your stereo. And if you want to ride, then here we go. This is Joy Time Radio.
And of course, that's the 5 tech things you should know about this special edition. If you have any questions, feel free to Twitter me over at Geekazine, geekazine@gmail.com. I'm over on Google+. Look for Jeffrey Powers, and you'll find me from there. We've got some great stuff. We've got some great video. In fact, I don't know if you've seen the Bacon Cat stuff lately, but I'll put that in the show notes. You'll see what I'm talking about. It's now got its own YouTube channel, and going to work on that from there. We will be back next week with 5 tech things you should know about, the regular format with everything else, and we'll talk about technology and so on and so forth. But thanks a lot for watching this special edition. And to Steve Jobs out there, with a personal message, I hope that you're doing well. And like I said in my article, I hope to be able to meet you someday in the near future and shake your hand, because if it wasn't for you, I wouldn't be in this technology. Of course, in the same aspect, if it wasn't for Bill Gates, I wouldn't be in what I do for technology either. So it's a 50-50 thing, but I'm going to tell you, it's amazing how you can shape one person, many people. I'm just one of them. So thanks a lot for watching. Thanks a lot for listening. We will see you next time on the 5 tech things you should know about. Take care.